Like many teachers, my first year of teaching was an absolute disaster. I had very few classroom management skills, and my patience was far thinner than I wanted it to be. And I learned the very hard way that students are disruptive and how to handle that disruption in my classroom. I couldn't understand why my students wouldn't just sit there and learn. They would throw things across my classroom, wouldn't study or take notes, and the most frustrating thing is that they never brought a pencil to class. One story that stands out is the story of a student who we will call Billy Joe. Now, Billy Joe struggled for many reasons. He would actively make fun of others in class. He spent way too much time with the principal, and he had a difficult home life. Despite this, I had a good relationship with the kid. We would talk and joke around. He confided in me what was happening, and I'd even figured out a way to convince him to do work in my classroom. Now, one day, I was helping him out, and despite all my normal tricks and tactics and every trick in the book, he outright refused to do anything. I was frustrated. I was done. I had dealt with so many other comments and disrespect from students throughout the day, I felt I couldn't help him, and I went to go help another student. Less than a second later, I hear the distinct noise of a backpack unzip, a sound that brought me back to childhood birthday parties, and another student going, "Billy Joe, are you stupid?" I turn around and there he is, on roller skates, skating around my classroom with the biggest smile on his face. With a clenched fist and gritted teeth, I managed to bark out, "Hallway now!" And before we were through the door, I called the principal. Instantly, Billy Joe was begging me to change my mind. Please, he was just trying to have fun, anything but the principal. I said nothing. When the principal got there, I simply stated what had happened, turned around, and walked back into my classroom. I didn't see Billy Joe the rest of the day, or the next, but when I did, everything was different. He no longer laughed and engaged in my jokes. He stopped confiding in me, and there was no way he was doing his work now. I didn't take the time to notice these changes when they first occurred, but I have thought a lot about them since. You see, when you decide to become a teacher, you go to school to learn how to be a teacher. You go through grueling hours of content classes and professional development and internships and placements and so many papers. Out of all of this, the most important thing you're going to learn, though, is how to be developmentally responsive to your students. Unfortunately, I have found that developmentally responsiveness is a finicky term that's gotten tangled up in the rest of teaching. It's something people say they're going to do, but no one really knows what it looks like, and I often call it a Band-Aid term. What being developmentally responsive actually means is that you're going to understand your students' developmental needs, and you're going to respond to them accordingly. We're able to understand those needs if we focus on the way that the brain works during young adolescence. Studies like those done in the Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews and the Middle School Journal tell us that the prefrontal cortex, the frontalmost part of your brain that controls decision-making and cognitive functioning, further develops to create a brain that thrives off of taking risks. At the same time, we witness a change to the limbic system, the part of the brain responsible for emotions. These two changes come together to create a brain that's malleable and one that we as teachers, parents, siblings, and caregivers have the ability to educate and inspire to be bright young leaders. We can only do this, though, if we understand our students, their abilities that they have, and what they can do. I often think back to the situation with Billy Joe, how he made the jump from feeling unhappy to risk-taking behavior so quickly, and how I acted out in frustration. Since then, I've learned there are several different methods you can use. And I often find that I think back to the developmentally responsive teaching styles I learned about in college and how you can use them to disrupt small and large classroom disturbances. We can do this by focusing on the four main concepts of developmentally responsive: teacher behavior, developmental needs of students, organizational structures, and relationships. Let's first look at me and how I behaved as a teacher. You may have noticed, but that story focused on me. how I was doing, what I was going through, and how difficult that situation was for me. While it's perfectly fine for us to be open and honest with our students about what we're going through, we need to ensure we don't let that vulnerability cloud our judgment. Things would have been very different if I had simply acknowledged his feelings and mine to come up with a system where maybe he took a break for 5 minutes and we check back in later. We need to learn to speak to our students with a balance of validating their experiences while also holding them to expectations. Many people call this a warm but strict approach, where we talk to our students in a way that hears what they're feeling and is compassionate to feel with them, and also strict enough to hold them to expectations and ensure that whatever they do, they're held accountable for it. Second, we can look at the developmental spectrum of our students. Billy Joe, for example, is diving straight into risk-taking behavior. He's putting on skates, skating around my classroom, and he's happy about that. The key to this is the why. At that time, Billy Joe was experiencing emotional pain. At that time, his limbic system was telling him he wasn't happy and was probably embarrassed. Now, he decided to put on skates and skate around, and while that is not the ideal choice, it's the very real choice he made, and it's a choice we have to compromise with. And one way we can provide other choices is by looking at the organizational structures in the classroom. How are the classroom norms set up to provide success to our students? Oftentimes, we as teachers set up our classrooms to make it easier on ourselves. The third concept of developmentally responsiveness, though, argues and makes the point that each structure we should put in place should be done with the intent of creating an environment where our students can best succeed. For example, creating a space where our students can regulate their emotions in the classroom with a timer. By doing this, we allowed our students to learn how to manage those emotions, reset, and have a structure in place to ensure that it's not abused. Lastly, and I could argue this is the most important, relationships. A relationship with each student can be saved from total devastation by just talking to them. When Billy Joe acted out, I sent him to the principal's office. I didn't think about the fact that while I was seeing it as a disciplinary action, he was receiving it as the fact that I didn't care and class was better off without him. This is often the message we send our students when we don't take the time to talk to them. Miss Gordon, the lovely 8th grade science teacher on my team, asked her students what they needed from her as a teacher. They said, "Talk to me. Don't talk at me." That relationship could be saved if we simply talk to our students and if we understand where they're coming from and make them feel heard, because their voice is important too. While we can compartmentalize and understand each of these pieces of developmentally responsive as much as we want to, it is not enough to be developmentally responsive teachers. We need to take these concepts and put them into action. We need to respond to these concepts accordingly and ensure that we are there. If our students are struggling to make the connection between their actions and their behaviors and the consequences, we need to help guide them to that. If our students are needing a space to cool off and regulate, we should provide that for them. If our students are putting on skates and skating around our classroom, we need to keep cool and talk to them. Our students spend more time at school with us than they do with their families at home. Our love and care for them is just as important as the love and care they deserve from their families. Unfortunately, we are currently seeing a mental health crisis in our young adolescents, especially after the pandemic hit. Studies like those done in the Journal of Young Adolescent Development tell us that our students are at a greater risk of sleep disorders and mental health problems, even at a time where it's unfortunately common. They need us to be developmentally responsive to their needs now more than ever. They need us to create space for them, talk to them, hear them out, and try again to be there for them. Because if not us, who will? Thank you.